In this video I will be 1v1ing the top leaderboard players ranging from the rank 73 all the way up to 8. As far as I know, all of them except one has much more experience playing on the Boston map. But I have a trick up to my sleeve also. I made this territories sheet to find out which of them are the most disconnected, so it should help me out a lot of when it comes to picking territories. The first 3 territory choices are very obvious. There are 2 territories continents in this map, so by picking one of these territories as the first player you're just forcing your opponent to pick the other one in the same continent. So obviously you will take a better one for yourself. And usually you will prioritize the territory which don't block you the way or block it the least. So the common trend for the first player is to pick these 3 territories like I did in this gameplay, with the second player taking the other one so to not give the first player the continental troop bonuses. And also looking to my territories disconnection sheet, these 3 territories the first player usually selects are more disconnected also than the ones which are being left for the second player. The lower number it is, the more disconnected the territory is. And the disconnection is important for both of the players. For the first player is because he would force his opponent to connect a lot of his territories, while for the second player is because to make his territories as little connected as possible, so the first player couldn't capture a lot of them. Anyway, this is how the map looks after our territory selection in the first game. What I like the most is that my opponent cannot add his army or a lot of troops in this territory, because with him having this territory selected and additionally having those 2 territories too, he would risk a lot of troops getting blocked. With my troops deployment, my strategy is to capture and guard those upper continents, and then with the army in the left is to capture some of these few territories continents also, so my opponent would be forced to invade them rather than capturing whichever territories he wants, and with that to increase my chances of at least holding something. However, I made a huge mistake by capturing that last territory. As by doing so, I made my opponent's biggest army to be accessible towards invading me into both of my bigger continents. So with that he afforded to add all of his new gotten troops next to one of my upper continents and with getting a good blitz roll to invade it. So that was very big mistake I made, so thanks for my opponent for pointing it out. What I noticed is that my opponent fortified his troops to his small continent, while still having other continents captured I need to invade, plus having lots of territories captured too. So I think I made a very great decision by letting him hold his upper continent, leaving his troops trapped, while making sure that all of his other continents will be invaded, and with that highly increasing my number of territories while capturing them in the way that it would let me capture as many continents as possible. Well, almost, as if I had selected the right pathing, then I would have captured that territory as well with its continent. But that was still enough because my opponent ended up invading only 2 out of my 4 continents. So that led me taking over a huge advantage and easily winning. And here is the rematch with my opponent going first. As his 4th territory pick he selects this territory over here, which I am considering it to be the best 4th territory pick for the first player also. While the long continent has slightly more disconnected territory, the long continent still has a lot of disconnected territories inside it. While next to that territory over here, the other 2 territories have much bigger connection numbers. Also then what my opponent does next is selects another more disconnected territory out of the 2 in this continent to force me select the most connected one. And with that even 3 of my territories became connected, so he did a very good job here. And this is how our territory setup looks in overall. I decided to split my troops into 2 different armies, putting them next to upper continents, so I would be able to counter my opponent if he decides to go for them. But my opponent put his troops to only 1 big army and in the territory which would be accessible to both of my armies. So by getting the attacker's advantage he crushes both of my armies successfully, and with capturing these continents around, he puts me in a very tough position in which it could be extremely hard to invade him into all of his continents, and with me failing he gets a very huge advantage and wins. In this game with my opponent going second, he selects this territory over here as his 4th territory pick. This is the best territory in this continent not only because it's the most disconnected looking to the territory's connection rating, but also it's because the only territory which is isolated inside the continent, while all other this continent territories are being borders. Then while with me selecting the most disconnected territory of the long continent, my opponent selects this territory, which is the best territory of that particular continent also. Not only because it's the most disconnected when looking to the territory's connection rating, but also because it's the only territory which is isolated inside the continent, while all other territories are being borders. And this is how our setup looks in overall. I let my opponent to take that whole continent, so he couldn't add any bigger counterattack army towards my left upper continent. What in my turn I did, is captured both of these small upper continents. And then taking down one of my opponent's armies, I managed to capture 3 extra continents from which my opponent's other army was blocked. And my opponent invaded all 3 of those while additionally capturing as many territories as possible, but with him not being able to invade both of the upper continents, I in my turn took over a big visible advantage and with that I won. In the second game we played I decided to put my troops into one single army as the second layer, while my opponent a big army of his troops into the right side continent, which he used to capture and properly guard that continent, and with the gotten troops he captured the upper right continent, which I was able to invade with me getting a big enough territorial troops bonus. And then I went to capture as many territories as possible but I was a bit too slow and ran out of time. And after my opponent's turn ended with him having all those continents and an army of 6 troops, I realized that the game is completely lost for me. Now in this game my opponent going first selected the most disconnected territory of the long continent as his 5th territory pick, so with that I decided to pick the territory next to it, so he couldn't potentially have a lot of territories in this continent connected in the straight line. And then my opponent as his 6th territory pick selected the best territory of this continent, which is way much better territory than any out of the other 3. What we can see from the territory's disconnection sheet, is that a territory next to it has a similar connection rating, 18 is pretty close next to 15, but that territory with 18, blocks the way towards that small continent above, so even though it has a low connection rating, it's not that much of a good territory to choose. Then I followed by selecting the best territory in this continent, while my opponent followed by selecting the second best territory in this continent. So then I selected the most disconnected territory in this continent, while my opponent followed with selecting the second best territory in this continent as well. Then I decided to choose that very disconnected territory, while my opponent went with the least connected territory of the biggest continent. So with that I decided to select a territory next to it, which is the only non-bordered territory inside this big continent. And then with my opponent selecting one of the long continent territories, I decided to go with the bottom territory of the right side continent, so my opponent wouldn't force me to select the middle one, which would make even 3 of my territories be connected like my previous opponents forced me to. But while I liked my territory picking choices in the beginning, I wasn't very satisfied with the territory choices at the end, as this is how our territory setup ended up being at the end. I ended up being cut off from both of the smallest continents, and a lot of my territories above ended up being connected with each other. So probably my troops' deployment choices were going to be very predictable from my opponent, whether I put them in one or a few separate armies. And with our troops' deployment reveal, I immediately knew that I'm losing this game, so unless my opponent gets extremely unlucky blitz rolls, but he didn't. But I didn't immediately give up and still tried my best, and with getting good enough manual rolls I was able to invade my opponent into all of his continents. But my opponent still had the territorial advantage, and with him recapturing these continents in this way, I knew that the game is lost for me. And then with me going first, this is how our territory setup ended up being. This time I decided to go with one big army. And since I couldn't crush my opponent troops, I went with capturing one of the upper continents with my newly gotten troops, And then with my biggest army I ended up capturing as many territories as possible in the way that will let me capture as many continents as possible. My opponent when getting to one of my upper continents was short on troops, but with getting an insanely good blitz roll still managed to invade it. And then a bad thing I realized is that my 7 troops army in the top upper continent became blocked, while I needed to capture a lot of territories in order to invade my opponent into all of his continents. But luckily enough my gotten troops were still enough to do that, and with that my opponent ended up being in a disadvantageous situation, so I won. Now while all other grandmasters in this video were experienced playing on these settings in the 1v1 tournaments, when it comes to my next opponent, I believe he wasn't really familiar with Boston, but regardless of that he is a very good 1v1 player. So I was wondering to see how his territory choices will differ from the other grandmasters I play in this video. And this is how our setup looked after we finished selecting our territories. This time I added my troops into one big army again, and luckily enough my opponent wasn't accessible to crush it. But he ended up capturing a ton of territories of mine, so what I realized is that even though I was going after the most disconnected territories, I should have definitely not selected that many of them in one single place. So overall, I wasn't too happy with my territory selection. And while I was in the territory's disadvantage, I still quite liked how the situation ended up being with me capturing 2 upper continents, but my opponent managed to invade one of them and that was fair enough, as the blitz roll for him was supposed to be favorable. So then I went even stronger with capturing one more continent, and this time I thought that I'm holding at least 2 continents for sure, but my opponent managed to invade them again, but this time with a very favorable manual roll. And then with my opponent invading my continents once again, I knew that he took over the advantage. But maybe that was a really mistake of mine of leaving these 2 troops over here, over fortifying them to that border territory. Anyway, my opponent ended up taking a big advantage and winning this game. And in the second game this is how our setup looked like. This time I decided to go with 2 different armies, with my left side army being much bigger because I was planning with it capturing a lot of territories. And my opponent ended up adding his army in a very far away from me place, and this time when capturing territories I was very careful to double check so I wouldn't unleash my opponent's biggest army towards my continents like I did playing with my first opponent in the first game. And this time everything ended up being very successfully. I ended up holding both of the continents, and then with capturing tons of territories I ended up taking a very visible advantage, so that's not really a surprise that I won. And in this game playing with another opponent I really liked my territory selection as the first player because I managed to connect a lot of them in the disconnected places of the map, so my opponent ended up connecting a lot of his territories in the middle of the map. And right there I'm not sure why I went with the idea to capture that long continent instead of small upper left continent, so please don't mind me. My opponent added his army in a very blocked place so besides that long continent, he wasn't accessible to invade any of my captured continents with his biggest army. And while in the second turn my opponent managed to recapture a lot of territories, it was clear that after the third round the game was lost for my opponent. And in this game going second I wasn't really satisfied with my territory selection that much as I made a lot of them to be connected. And then my army's placement wasn't the best either as I ended up putting it in the place which wouldn't be accessible towards neither of the small upper continents. And with my opponent capturing the long continent I wasn't accessible towards it with my biggest army either, but I managed to invade it with my newly gotten troops, and then I captured tons of the territories. But that wasn't enough, and after the second round the situation was completely losing for me, so I lost. My final thoughts after the games is that I should have definitely played with blizzards if I wanted to make it more fair for the second player like my opponents were suggesting to me. But in overall I think whether with blizzards or not the Boston map with world domination mode could be very advantageous for the first player, as besides it having a bunch of territories, these 2 upper continents could really mess the things up for the second player. but mostly the main thought behind playing these games was to test out my territory's disconnection sheet and see if other top grandmasters would be prioritizing picking the same territories also, so that would prove my disconnection sheet viability. Hopefully this video will help a lot of people out to understand how to pick the territories in the Boston map better, and for the very best 1v1 players hopefully this disconnection sheet theory will be a big finding on how to improve their territories picking even on the maps in which they do not have any experience at. I didn't want to over-expand here, so I will leave all the information on how my territory's disconnection sheet was made in the description below. So you could apply the theory as well, and with that a very big step would be made towards the community's gameplay improvement when it comes to 1v1 word domination games playing with manual setup, so even bigger discoveries could be made. If you're interested in learning about the 1v1 games more, then I would recommend you watching the 1v1 strategy tips playlist.